Today's Daily Dose of Math is an examination of the common denominator. We use the common denominator when we add and subtract fractions. But there's a difference between finding a common denominator and finding the lowest common denominator. The lowest common denominator is the most efficient one to use, but you can answer the question properly and correctly if you find a common denominator. We're going to look at this example, 3/8 minus 1/4, and we're going to try doing it both ways so that we can see the difference between finding any common denominator and finding the lowest. We'll start by finding the lowest. The most efficient way to find the lowest common denominator of 8 and 4 is to list the multiples of 8 and 4. And I'm doing that here. For 8, we have 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48, and it keeps going. For 4, we have 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28, 32, 40, and it keeps going. I didn't have to make such a long list, but I chose to for the purposes of this example. The next thing to do after making our lists of multiples is to try to find a number that's on both lists. But specifically, we want to find the first number on both lists, reading from the left. And that number will be 8. This will be our lowest common denominator. There are other possibilities, though, for a common denominator. 16 is on both lists. 24 is on both lists. And I can keep going. But I'm going to use 8 as my common denominator. That means I'm going to make two equivalent fractions and replace 3/8 and 1/4 with those. And I'm going to do my subtraction and get an answer that will also have 8 as its denominator. Now the first fraction, 3/8, to convert it into a fraction over 8, doesn't require any change at all because it's already over 8. This is one of the things that's different between using a common denominator and the lowest common denominator. When you're using the lowest common denominator, sometimes you get lucky and one of the fractions doesn't have to be changed. So we have 3/8. The second fraction, the denominator is a 4, and I have to change it so it's equivalent but has 8 as its denominator. I ask myself, what do I have to do to 4 to get it to turn into 8? I have to multiply it by 2. So therefore, I'm going to multiply its numerator by 2 as well. 1 times 2 is 2. So 1/4 becomes 2/8. Now I have my equivalent fractions over the common denominator, and I can do my subtraction. 3 minus 2 is 1. So I have 1/8 as my answer. And here we see the other benefit of using the lowest common denominator. Besides getting lucky sometimes and not having to change one of the fractions, we also end up with a reduced fraction as our answer. We don't have to do an extra step to reduce the final answer to lowest terms. Now let's compare this to finding a common denominator. One trick that a lot of students like to use to find a common denominator is to just take the denominators of the two original fractions, the 8 and the 4, and multiply them by each other. 8 times 4 is 32. So that means I can use 32 as my common denominator. We can see that 32 was on both lists as well. And that was why I made such a long list for both numbers when I listed the multiples. Yes, 32 is a perfectly good common denominator to use when subtracting these two fractions. It means I have to create the equivalent fractions, and both of them have to have 32 as their denominator. How do I get 8 to turn into 32? I multiply it by 4. so I also have to multiply its numerator, the 3, by a 4. 4 times 3 is 12, so 3/8 turns into 12 over 32. How do I get 4 to turn into 32? I multiply it by an 8. So I have to multiply its numerator, this 1, by an 8. 1 times 8 is 8, so 1/4 becomes 8 over 32. I'm going to get an answer which will have 32 as its denominator. 12 minus 8 is 4, so I have 4 over 32 as my answer, but it's not reduced. I have to reduce it to lowest terms. So what I need is to find the greatest common factor of 4 and 32, and that is 4. I divide both top and bottom by 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1, 32 divided by 4 is 8, so my final answer is 1/8. The same answer I got with the other approach. So here we can see the difference between finding a common denominator like 32 and the lowest common denominator like 8. We benefit in two ways from finding the lowest common denominator. We got lucky with our 3/8 and we didn't have to change it at all when we found our equivalent fractions, and then we didn't have to reduce the final answer. But a student who used the second method and used 32 as their common denominator still is able to get the question correct, although they have an extra step to do in reducing the final answer. That is today's Daily Dose of Math. Please like, subscribe, and share.